4:44 a.m. Pakistan Standard Time. The Arabian Sea, in the pre-dawn hours, carries the accumulated heat of the subcontinent's spring. Water temperature at 28 degrees Celsius, moderate sea state, a haze layer at the horizon that blurs the line between ocean and sky. The USS Carrier Group, holding station 340 nautical miles southwest of Karachi, had been in this position for 11 days, and the two Aegis destroyers that had joined it 8 days ago were not there for the carrier's protection. They were there for something the United States had never publicly attempted, acting as a ballistic missile defense buffer between two nuclear-armed states that were, as of 72 hours ago, in active armed conflict along their shared border. The conflict had begun 17 days earlier with a series of surgical airstrikes by the Indian Air Force against militant infrastructure in Pakistani-administered Kashmir. Strikes that the Indian government characterized as a counter-terrorism operation under its right of self-defense, and that the Pakistani government characterized as an act of war against its sovereign territory. The exchange that followed in the subsequent 72 hours had involved artillery, fighter aircraft, and, critically, the test-like firing of 2 Babur cruise missiles by Pakistan against an Indian Army Brigade headquarters 40 kilometers inside Indian Punjab. A strike that had not been publicly announced and had been detected by the U.S. within minutes through its signals intelligence infrastructure in the region. The Indian government had issued a formal ultimatum 60 hours ago. The ultimatum's deadline had passed at midnight. It was now 4:44 a.m. The U.S. decision to deploy Aegis BMD capability to the Arabian Sea had been the product of an emergency NSC deliberation that had lasted 14 hours and had produced a finding that was without precedent in U.S. strategic history: that the United States would attempt to intercept ballistic missiles launched by either India or Pakistan against the other's nuclear delivery infrastructure, if such launches could be assessed as constituting first use of nuclear delivery systems. Not conventional ballistic missiles. Not cruise missiles. Nuclear delivery systems on ballistic trajectories. The Gauri, the Shaheen series, the Indian Agni variants, whose employment would constitute the crossing of the nuclear threshold that the United States had assessed as the most catastrophically destabilizing event in the 21st century strategic environment. The finding had no precedent in the post-Cold War security architecture. Every prior U.S. ballistic missile defense deployment had been oriented against state adversaries targeting U.S. forces or territory. The Arabian Sea deployment was different in category. It was oriented against the missiles of states that were not U.S. adversaries, launched not at the United States but at each other, in a conflict the United States had not caused and could not resolve through its own military action. The legal and strategic framework that authorized it was untested. The NSC deliberation had produced sharply divided assessments about whether the intercepts would de-escalate or accelerate the crisis. The finding rested on 3 legal and strategic pillars. First, both India and Pakistan were signatories to bilateral communication frameworks with the United States that included nuclear risk reduction protocols. Second, the potential destruction of either side's nuclear delivery infrastructure in a first strike created an overwhelming use-it-or-lose-it incentive for the other side to immediately employ its remaining capability, producing a full nuclear exchange from a condition that a BMD intercept could interrupt. Third, the U.S. had communicated its intentions and its specific intercept parameters to both governments through secure channels at 9 a.m. the previous morning. Both governments had received the communication. Neither had responded. The absence of a response from Pakistan was assessed by the CIA as probable acquiescence. Its government was in a position where a U.S. intercept of Indian nuclear delivery systems, if India launched first, was strategically advantageous. The absence of a response from India was assessed as ambiguous. India's nuclear doctrine explicitly rejected any interference with its strategic deterrent. A U.S. intercept of an Indian nuclear ballistic missile, from India's perspective, was not a neutral act. It was an alignment with Pakistan, This was the geopolitical condition under which the Aegis destroyers were operating at 4:44 a.m. They were there to prevent a nuclear exchange. Their presence might provoke one. The watch on the forward Aegis destroyer, the vessel positioned closest to the Pakistani coast, its AN/SPY-1D radar in continuous track mode covering the ballistic missile launch corridors from Khuzdar and Kuchlak in Balochistan, where Pakistan's Gauri and Shaheen batteries were assessed as having been elevated to launch readiness, had been an 11-day exercise in sustained vigilance that its crew had trained for and had hoped never to be required to perform for real. At 4:44 a.m., the long-range radar at Thule Air Base in Greenland, one of the ballistic missile early warning system's 3 primary tracking stations, registered a launch signature from the Fateh Jang complex in Punjab province, approximately 50 kilometers northwest of Rawalpindi. The signature was assessed as a Shaheen-III medium-range ballistic missile. The Shaheen-III had a range of 2,750 kilometers and carried a payload capacity consistent with either a conventional or nuclear warhead. The trajectory analysis completed in 8.2 seconds. The projected aim point, Jaisalmer Air Station in Rajasthan, India, one of the Indian Air Force's primary nuclear-capable strike bases, housing aircraft assessed as carrying standoff nuclear delivery systems. A ballistic missile from Pakistan's Shaheen-III inventory on a trajectory to a nuclear-capable Indian Air Force base at 4:44 a.m., 72 hours into an active armed conflict with an expired ultimatum. U.S. Space Command transmitted the launch alert to the USS Destroyer at 4:44 a.m. The Aegis system had already acquired the track on its own radar array. The engagement decision was the most consequential single authorization in the history of ballistic missile defense. The USS Destroyer's commanding officer had a pre-delegated authorization from the National Command Authority, transmitted at 9 a.m. the previous morning simultaneously with the notification to both governments, to engage ballistic missile launches assessed as targeting nuclear-capable infrastructure during the active conflict period. The authorization was specific about what it covered and what it did not. It covered launches from either state-targeting nuclear-capable delivery infrastructure, nuclear weapons storage facilities, or command and control nodes assessed as nuclear command authority. It did not cover conventional ballistic missile launches against military or civilian targets that did not meet those criteria. The Shaheen-III on a trajectory to Jaisalmer met the criteria. Jaisalmer Air Station was on the nuclear-capable infrastructure list in the authorization document. The commanding officer confirmed the track classification against the authorization criteria in 4 seconds. He transmitted the engagement decision at 4:44 a.m. SM-3 Block 2A. The only interceptor in the U.S. inventory capable of engaging a medium-range ballistic missile in mid-course phase from the Arabian Sea against a target trajectory over the subcontinent's landmass. The engagement geometry required the SM-3 to reach its intercept altitude over a landmass it was launching from the sea to cover, a geometry that the Aegis fire control system had modeled against Shaheen-class targets in the Pacific Fleet's classified engagement planning database but had never executed operationally from this specific launch position. The Arabian Sea launch geometry placed the intercept window over the Sindh-Rajasthan border region at altitudes above 300 kilometers, at the outer edge of the SM-3's optimal engagement envelope. The fire control solution was achievable. It was achievable at the margin. Both the commanding officer and his weapons officer knew this when they confirmed the engagement. Its range extended to the required engagement geometry. Its performance against a Shaheen-III class target had been validated in 2 of the 3 test intercepts conducted against comparable targets. 2 of 3. A tested success rate of 67% per engagement. 3 SM-3 Block 2A interceptors were allocated to the Shaheen-III track. The pre-authorization doctrine for a nuclear threshold engagement specified 3 interceptors per track, the same doctrine that governed GMD engagements against ICBM threats reflecting the same logic. The consequences of a missed intercept against a nuclear delivery system were unacceptable. The first SM-3 launched at 4:45 a.m. The second at 4:45 a.m., 14 seconds behind the first. The third at 4:46 a.m., on a different approach geometry designed to ensure that a miss by the first or second did not place the third in a degraded intercept position. In the 13 minutes between the first SM-3 launch and the intercept window, two things happened that were beyond the USS destroyer's ability to control or predict. The Pakistani government, which had been monitoring the Shaheen-III launch from its National Command Authority's alternative command post in the Khyber Hills, transmitted an emergency communication to its military launch authority at 4:46 a.m. The communication was intercepted by the NSA within 40 seconds and transmitted to U.S. Space Command at 4:47 a.m. The communication indicated that the Shaheen-III launch had been unauthorized. The launch authority had been assumed by Field Commander at Fateh Jang, whose orders had been misinterpreted as a release authorization during a communications degradation event caused by Indian electronic warfare activity over the previous 6 hours. The Pakistani government was not attempting to launch nuclear weapons. A field commander had launched one by accident. This information arrived at the USS destroyer's flag bridge at 4:47 a.m. The SM-3s were already in flight. They could not be recalled. The engagement was proceeding. The commanding officer read the NSA intercept summary and transmitted a status report to U.S. Space Command. 3 interceptors in flight. Intercept window in 11 minutes. Unauthorized launch assessment received, requesting guidance. U.S. Space Command's response at 4:49 a.m. Proceed with intercept. An unauthorized launch was more dangerous than an authorized one, not less. An unauthorized Shaheen-III impacting Jaisalmer Air Station would produce an Indian nuclear response regardless of the Pakistani government's subsequent claims of error. The intercept was more necessary, not less, given the unauthorized launch assessment. The second event was the Indian government's own response to the Shaheen-III launch, which it had detected through its own early warning systems before the U.S. alert had been transmitted. At 4:46 a.m., India's Strategic Forces Command had authorized a response launch. 2 Agni-II ballistic missiles from a road-mobile launcher in Rajasthan, targeted at Pakistan's Kahuta nuclear complex and the Fateh Jang launch facility itself. The authorization had been transmitted before the Indian government was aware of the U.S. intercept in progress. The 2 Agni-II launches were detected by the SBIRS satellite at 4:48 a.m. Alert to the second Aegis destroyer, positioned further south, closer to the Indian coast, whose engagement geometry covered the ballistic trajectories from Rajasthan, arrived at 4:48 a.m. 2 Agni-II missiles, targeting a nuclear complex and the launch facility that had just fired an apparently unauthorized round at Indian territory. The second destroyer's commanding officer had the same pre-authorized engagement authority. The Kahuta nuclear complex was on the nuclear-capable infrastructure list. As a nuclear weapons production and storage facility, it was precisely the category of target the authorization covered. The Fateh Jang launch facility was not on the list. It was a conventional military installation. The Agni-II targeting Fateh Jang was not covered by the engagement authority. One of 2 Agni-IIs would be engaged. One would not. The second destroyer transmitted its engagement decision at 4:48 a.m. SM-3 engagement authorized against the Kahuta-targeted Agni-II. No engagement against the Fateh Jang-targeted Agni-II. 2 SM-3 Block 2. A interceptors allocated to the Kahuta track. At 4:52 a.m., with all 5 SM-3s in flight and multiple intercept windows approaching simultaneously, the U.S. Space Command's Operations Center was managing the most complex single engagement sequence in U.S. strategic history. 3 interceptors against a Pakistani ballistic missile on an unauthorized trajectory. 2 interceptors against an Indian ballistic missile targeting a nuclear complex. 1 Indian ballistic missile on a trajectory to a conventional military target, unengaged, continuing its flight. The Shaheen-III intercept resolved first. At 4:57 a.m., the first SM-3's exo-atmospheric intercept vehicle approached the Shaheen-III at 380 kilometers altitude above the Rajasthan-Pakistan border region. The kinetic intercept was confirmed by radar at 4:57 a.m. The Shaheen-III's structural integrity ceased. The track split into debris. The second SM-3 was directed to stand down. The third was directed to stand down. All 3 had not been needed. The first intercept had succeeded. At 4:58 a.m., the second destroyer's SM-3, targeting the Kahuta-bound Agni-II, achieved its intercept window. The first SM-3 intercepted the Agni-II at 4:58 a.m. at 340 kilometers altitude. The track ceased. The second SM-3 was directed to stand down. At 4:59 a.m., the unengaged Agni-II, targeting the Fateh Jang launch facility, continued its terminal phase and impacted the facility at 4:59 a.m. The Fateh Jang complex sustained significant structural damage. The launch support infrastructure and the vehicle that had fired the unauthorized Shaheen-III were assessed as non-operational. No nuclear materials were at the site. It was a conventional military facility. It had been struck by a conventional ballistic missile. The authorization had correctly excluded it from engagement. At 5:02 a.m., 18 minutes after the first Shaheen-III launch, the active intercept sequence was complete. 2 nuclear delivery systems, 1 Pakistani, 1 Indian, had been intercepted by USBMD in mid-course phase above the subcontinent. 1 conventional Indian ballistic missile had been permitted to continue and had struck a conventional Pakistani military installation. The distinction between the 2 categories of targets had been maintained under operational conditions at 4:48 a.m. in the dark, with interceptors already in flight and 2 governments in the middle of an active armed conflict. The political consequence of the U.S. engagement arrived faster than any military consequence. The Pakistani government transmitted an emergency communication to Washington at 5:04 a.m. Not a protest, but a formal request for immediate consultation. The communication acknowledged the U.S. intercept of the unauthorized Shaheen-III and stated that the government's National Command Authority had regained communications integrity with its strategic forces. It requested U.S. assistance in communicating directly with the Indian government to prevent further escalation. The Indian government's communication arrived at 5:11 a.m. It protested the U.S. intercept of the Agni-II as an interference with India's right of self-defense. The protest was formal and sharp. The communication also, in its final paragraph, noted that India had been notified that the Shaheen-III was an unauthorized launch and stated that India was prepared to consider a ceasefire communication through a mutually acceptable third-party channel if Pakistan formally acknowledged the unauthorized nature of the launch and committed to restoring full National Command Authority control over its strategic forces within 6 hours. Both governments were communicating. Both had sustained personnel losses from conventional weapons. Neither had conducted a successful nuclear delivery. The threshold had not been crossed. The SM-3 intercepts had created a gap, a pause in the escalation sequence, during which both governments had received information that changed their calculations. The Pakistani government had regained communications integrity. The Indian government had received confirmation of the unauthorized launch through U.S. channels. The pause was not a ceasefire. It was not a resolution. It was 18 minutes in which the automated logic of nuclear escalation had been interrupted by 2 SM-3 Block 2A interceptors operating under pre-authorized engagement authority from a ship in the Arabian Sea. 18 minutes. 2 intercepts. 1 gap in the escalation sequence. The gap was not certainty. It was opportunity. The escalation logic that had been running since the first Indian airstrike 17 days earlier had produced a sequence that, left uninterrupted, had one projected outcome: a full nuclear exchange between two states that together held approximately 340 nuclear warheads in their operational inventories. The two SM-3s had not resolved the conflict. They had created an 18-minute pause in the automated logic of a system that had been accelerating toward its worst-case output. In that pause, the Pakistani National Command Authority had regained communications integrity. In that pause, the Indian government had received confirmation that the incoming missile was an unauthorized act rather than a deliberate first use. In that pause, the calculation on both sides had changed from responding to a nuclear attack to managing a conventional conflict with a nuclear accident at its edge. What both governments did with that gap was not a U.S. military decision. The ceasefire communication request from India was transmitted to Pakistan through the Swiss Embassy channel at 5:19 a.m. Pakistan's response arrived at 5:47 a.m. The content of both communications was classified. The fact of their exchange was not. Time from first Shaheen-III. Detection to completion of intercept sequence: 18 minutes. Time from first intercept confirmation to first post-intercept diplomatic communication: 7 minutes. Weapons detected and engaged by USBMD. 1 Shaheen-III MRBM. Unauthorized launch trajectory to nuclear-capable Indian Air Station. 1 Agni-II MRBM. Authorized response launch trajectory to Pakistani nuclear complex. Intercept results: Shaheen-III. First SM-3 intercept confirmed at 4:57 a.m. 380 kilometers altitude. Agni-II targeting Kahuta. First SM-3 intercept confirmed at 4:58 a.m. 340 kilometers altitude. Non-engaged 1 Agni-II MRBM targeting Fateh Jang conventional military facility. Outside engagement authorization criteria. Impacted 4:59 a.m. Facility non-operational, no nuclear materials present. U.S. assets expended: 5 SM-3 Block 2A interceptors. 3 against Shaheen-III, 1 used, 2 stood down post-intercept. 2 against Agni-II Kahuta track, 1 used, 1 stood down post-intercept. Replacement timeline: standard resupply cycle. No U.S. vessel, aircraft, or personnel engaged or injured. Assessment: nuclear threshold not crossed. Both nuclear delivery systems intercepted before impact. Conventional strike by unengaged Agni-II against conventional Pakistani military target occurred within engagement authorization parameters. First post-intercept diplomatic communications initiated by both governments within 25 minutes of intercept completion. The 2 Aegis destroyers maintained their station in the Arabian Sea. The engagement authority remained active. The conflict had not ended. The threshold had been held, for now, by the geometry of 2 intercepts at 340 and 380 kilometers above a subcontinent that had been building toward this moment for 70 years and had approached it before. Both times it had stepped back. This time it had required 2 SM-3 Block 2A interceptors and an unauthorized launch order from a field commander who had misread a communications degradation event as a release authorization. The gap between that misreading and a nuclear exchange was 18 minutes and 2 interceptors. The commanding officers of both destroyers filed their engagement reports at 6 a.m. The reports were classified at the highest available level. Both reports concluded with the same standard format closing: engagement complete, unit combat effective, awaiting further orders. Neither commanding officer added anything beyond the standard format. The format was sufficient. What had happened was in the reports. What came next was not their decision.